There was a time when flying on Spirit Airlines meant one thing. You found a ticket online so cheap you assumed it had to be a mistake. $29, $39, sometimes less than the cost of airport parking. For millions of Americans, Spirit became the airline of impossible deals. The bright yellow planes promising that for the price of a nice dinner, you could be in another state by morning. Of course, there was a catch. Actually, several. Carry-on bag? Extra. Seat selection? Extra. Printed boarding pass? Extra. Water? Practically a luxury. Flying Spirit often felt less like booking a flight and more like negotiating with a very aggressive vending machine. Customers mocked it relentlessly. It became the punchline of airline jokes, the internet's favorite travel horror story, an airline people claimed to hate, yet kept flying anyway. Because despite the complaints, despite the memes, despite the endless viral stories of cramped seats, surprise fees, and delayed flights, Spirit's planes stayed full. Its revenue soared. Its stock surged. And for years, it looked like one of the smartest business models in modern aviation. So how does a company with packed planes, national brand recognition, and millions of paying customers end up fighting for survival? How does America's most notorious budget airline go from industry disruptor to industry warning sign? This is the rise, the turbulence, and fall of Spirit Airlines. I'm Ahmed, and this is the Money Archives, where every fortune tells a story. Before we dive in, if stories like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to the Money Archives. And tell me in the comments, which company's rise or fall should we uncover next? To understand how Spirit found itself in crisis, we first need to understand how one of America's most hated airlines became one of its most successful. Long before the bright yellow planes, before the baggage fees, and before millions of travelers learned that the phrase cheap flight can come with quite a few conditions, Spirit Airlines was not even an airline. Its story actually begins in 1964, when the company started as a small Michigan trucking business called Clippert Trucking Company. Not exactly the glamorous origin story you might expect from one of America's most recognizable airlines. But over time, that transportation company evolved, and in 1983, entrepreneur Ned Homfeld launched an aviation business under the name Charter One Airlines. Now, despite the name, Charter One was not a typical airline in the way most people think of one today. It was primarily a charter and vacation operator, flying travelers, mostly from the Midwest, to leisure destinations like Atlantic City, Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and Florida. Rather than selling individual tickets the way major airlines did, the company focused more on bundled vacation travel. You booked the package, and they handled the flight. For much of the 1980s, Charter One remained a relatively small and niche operation. It was regional, limited in scale, and largely unknown outside the markets it served. But by the early 1990s, management recognized a major limitation in that business model. Charter flights could only take the company so far. If they wanted real growth, they needed to enter the scheduled airline business and compete directly for passengers. So in 1992, the company made a transformational decision. It acquired jet aircraft, shifted into scheduled passenger service, and rebranded itself as Spirit Airlines. This was more than just a new name. It was a complete reinvention of the business. Spirit was no longer simply flying vacation packages. It was now entering one of the most competitive industries in America, going head-to-head with giants like American Airlines, Delta Airlines, and United Airlines. And that immediately raised the obvious question: how does a relatively tiny airline compete with companies that large? The answer was simple. It could not beat them on prestige. It could not beat them on comfort. It could not beat them on loyalty programs or premium service. So it chose the one area where smaller airlines can still win: price. Spirit's leadership understood that there was a massive group of travelers who did not care about luxury. They did not care about complimentary snacks, wider seats, or polished service. They cared about one thing above all else: getting from point A to point B for the lowest possible price. If the ticket was cheap enough, many customers would gladly tolerate inconvenience. They would accept cramped seating, limited amenities, and a less comfortable experience if it meant saving real money. That insight became the foundation of Spirit's strategy. Throughout the 1990s, the airline expanded steadily, moving its headquarters to Miramar, Florida, and focusing heavily on leisure and vacation routes. It built a network centered around Florida, the Caribbean, Latin America, and other destinations popular with price-sensitive travelers. But even as Spirit grew, management realized that simply being cheap was not enough. Plenty of airlines could offer discounted fares from time to time. To truly stand out, Spirit needed to go further than everyone else. It needed to become not just a low-cost airline, but an ultra-low-cost airline. That meant rethinking the entire airline model. Seats would be tighter, planes would be packed denser, amenities would be reduced, costs would be cut aggressively across the board. The airline would remove anything considered non-essential in order to drive the base fare as low as possible. Spirit's goal was not merely to be affordable. Its goal was to post fares so low that consumers would stop in disbelief when they saw them. Prices so cheap they dominated travel search engines and made every competitor look expensive by comparison. And that strategy worked, because Spirit discovered something incredibly powerful about consumer behavior. If you make the ticket cheap enough, people will tolerate almost anything. And that realization would soon lead Spirit to build one of the most controversial business models in modern aviation. Because as it turned out, the ticket price was never really the product. Spirit Airlines had found its lane. It was not trying to be luxurious. It was not trying to be prestigious. It was not even trying to be liked. It was trying to be cheaper than everyone else. But there was an obvious problem. Airlines do not become profitable by simply lowering prices forever. This is one of the most expensive industries in the world. Every flight requires fuel, crew, maintenance, gate fees, insurance, airport slots, and highly regulated operations. The economics are brutal. Even some of the largest airlines in history have gone bankrupt trying to make the numbers work. So, if Spirit wanted to build its entire identity around ultra-low fares, it needed a way to offer cheap tickets without becoming a cheap company. The answer arrived in the form of one man. In 2005, Spirit appointed Ben Baldanza as Chief Executive Officer. Baldanza was a veteran airline executive with experience at carriers like US Airways and Continental. And he believed the future of budget flying in America was not simply lower prices, it was unbundling. His thesis was straightforward. Most airlines were packaging too much into the ticket. They were forcing every passenger to pay for services they may not even want. Checked bags, seat assignments, snacks, flexibility, convenience. These costs were being baked into the fare whether the customer used them or not. Baldanza believed Spirit could undercut everyone by stripping the ticket down to its absolute core: transportation only. Under his leadership, Spirit fully embraced the ultra-low-cost carrier model. The fare would cover one thing and one thing only: a seat on the airplane. Everything beyond that would become optional and separately monetized. To critics, it felt ridiculous. To Wall Street, it looked genius. Because what Spirit was really doing was transforming itself from a traditional airline into something closer to a highly optimized revenue machine. The company became obsessed with what the airline industry calls ancillary revenue, income earned beyond the base fare. And Spirit excelled at it. By the early 2000s, Spirit was generating more ancillary revenue per passenger than almost any airline in the United States. In some years, these add-on fees represented well over 40% of total revenue, an astonishing figure in an industry where most competitors still relied primarily on ticket sales. That changed the economics of the business entirely. Instead of fighting competitors on total price, Spirit fought them on perceived price. A traveler searching online might see Spirit's fare at the very top of the page, dramatically cheaper than everyone else. That low advertised fare got the click. It got the customer into the booking funnel. And from there, the airline could begin layering in revenue through upsells and add-ons. It was not merely pricing strategy, it was psychological strategy. And it worked exceptionally well. After going public in 2011, Spirit's financial performance quickly turned heads. Investors were drawn to the company's margins, growth, and disruptive model. Over the next several years, the stock surged as Spirit expanded rapidly across the United States and beyond. For a time, Spirit became one of the airline industry's most successful disruptors. Even its competitors began adapting. Major carriers that once marketed themselves as superior alternatives started introducing stripped-down fare classes of their own. The rise of basic economy across the airline industry was, in many ways, a response to the pressure Spirit helped create. Spirit had forced the market to change. But in doing so, it also created a dangerous contradiction. Because while the model was financially efficient, and while investors loved the numbers, customers often hated the experience. Spirit had built a business model that generated profit by making flying feel transactional, restrictive, and often frustrating. It could squeeze more money out of each passenger than almost anyone else. But every fee, every rule, and every inconvenience chipped away at customer goodwill. And over time, Spirit stopped being known merely as the cheap airline. It became known as the airline people loved to hate. Spirit's business model was working. Wall Street loved the margins. Passengers kept booking flights. The airline expanded rapidly across the country. But there was one major problem. People absolutely hated it. By the mid-2000s, Spirit Airlines had become less of an airline and more of a cultural punchline. Social media was filled with jokes, horror stories, and viral complaints. Entire internet threads were dedicated to warning first-time passengers what to expect. Flying Spirit became something people talked about the way they talk about surviving a mildly unpleasant medical procedure. And yet, the planes stayed full, because for all the criticism, Spirit understood something fundamental about consumer behavior. Most travelers care more about price than pride. Passengers might complain about the cramped seats. They might swear never to fly Spirit again. They might post angry tweets from the terminal. And then, the next time they booked a trip, they would sort by lowest fare and choose Spirit all over again. That dynamic allowed the airline to grow at an extraordinary pace. Between 2010 and 2019, Spirit became one of the fastest-growing airlines in America, expanding its fleet, entering new markets, and carrying tens of millions of passengers annually. But beneath that growth, serious cracks were forming, because Spirit's customers were not loyal. They were transactional. People did not choose Spirit because they trusted the brand. They chose it because it was cheapest. That meant Spirit's relationship with its customer base was unusually fragile. The moment another airline came close enough on price, many travelers would leave without hesitation. And over time, that became a bigger problem. Because Spirit's success had not gone unnoticed, legacy airlines began adapting. Major carriers introduced basic economy fares, baggage restrictions, and stripped-down ticket options of their own. In other words, the rest of the industry started copying the very tactics that once made Spirit unique. The more competitors learned from Spirit, the less differentiated Spirit became. And when your entire business model is built around being the cheapest, losing that edge is dangerous. But pricing pressure was only part of the problem. Spirit's operations were also built on an extremely lean foundation. The airline ran tight schedules, packed aircraft utilization, and minimal slack throughout its network. That efficiency boosted profitability when everything ran smoothly. But when anything went wrong, the effects spread quickly. A weather delay in one city could ripple across the network. A staffing shortage could trigger widespread cancellations. A maintenance issue could derail dozens of downstream flights. Spirit had optimized for efficiency, not resilience. And because it lacked the network depth and redundancy of larger airlines, recovering from disruptions was often far more difficult. This created a dangerous contradiction at the heart of the business. Spirit needed to operate with precision in order for its model to work. But the airline industry is inherently chaotic. Weather happens, mechanical issues happen, staffing shortages happen, fuel prices rise, demand fluctuates. And Spirit had built a system with very little room for those realities. Its margins looked strong on paper, but only as long as the machine kept running perfectly. By the late 2000s, that machine was beginning to show strain. Costs across the airline industry were climbing. Labor became more expensive. Fuel remained volatile. Maintenance costs increased. Airport fees rose. And while every airline faced these pressures, Spirit was uniquely constrained in how it could respond. Because when your brand is built entirely around low prices, you cannot simply raise fares too much. Do that, and customers may stop choosing you altogether. This was the paradox of Spirit Airlines. Its greatest strength, being ultra cheap, was also its greatest weakness. It gave the company rapid growth, but it trapped the business in a constant race to remain cheaper than everyone else. And as competitors improved, costs rose, and operations became more complex. That race became harder and harder to win. Spirit had built a business model that could thrive in ideal conditions, but it had not built one designed for chaos. And in 2020, chaos arrived. In 2020, the storm finally hit. When the COVID-19 pandemic brought global travel to a standstill, the airline industry was devastated almost overnight. Airports emptied, flights were grounded, and carriers around the world scrambled to survive. But for Spirit Airlines, the crisis was especially brutal, because Spirit's business model had been built for one thing: constant demand. Its planes needed to stay full. Its aircraft needed to keep moving. Its razor-thin economics depended on volume. And when that volume disappeared, the machine stopped working. Like the rest of the industry, Spirit borrowed heavily to survive the pandemic. Debt piled up, cash reserves shrank, and though travel demand eventually returned, Spirit emerged from the crisis weaker, more leveraged, and far less flexible than before. Then came the recovery, and somehow things got worse. In August 2021, Spirit suffered a massive operational meltdown. A combination of weather disruptions, staffing shortages, and scheduling strain triggered a chain reaction across its tightly wound network. Over the course of a week, the airline cancelled more than 2,000 flights, stranding passengers nationwide. For most airlines, a disruption like that is damaging. For Spirit, it was catastrophic, because customers already expected the worst. The meltdown reinforced every negative stereotype surrounding the brand and further eroded what little goodwill remained. Meanwhile, costs across the industry were surging. Fuel prices climbed, labor costs increased, maintenance grew more expensive. Inflation squeezed Spirit's core low-income customer base, and Spirit's old advantage, being dramatically cheaper than everyone else, was shrinking. Management knew the company needed a lifeline. So in 2022, Spirit agreed to merge with Frontier Airlines in a deal that would have created the nation's largest ultra-low-cost carrier. But before the merger could close, a surprise bidder appeared. JetBlue Airways offered more money, much more. After months of shareholder pressure and bidding wars, Spirit abandoned the Frontier deal and agreed to sell itself to JetBlue for $3.8 billion. To many investors, it looked like salvation. Spirit would be bought out, shareholders would get paid, management would finally have an exit. There was just one problem. The US government hated the deal. Regulators argued that removing Spirit from the market would reduce competition and lead to higher airfares. After months of legal battles, a federal judge blocked the merger in January 2024, ruling the acquisition would harm consumers. Just like that, Spirit's rescue plan vanished, and the market panicked. Its stock collapsed nearly 50% in the aftermath. Analysts immediately began speculating that bankruptcy was no longer a possibility, it was a probability. They were right. In November 2024, Spirit filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
Major news right now from Spirit Airlines as we head into the busy holiday travel season. Spirit says it is filing for bankruptcy. The airline says it's still operating as business as usual.
The company attempted to restructure its debt and keep flying while reorganizing. It briefly emerged from restructuring in March 2025, hoping to stabilize operations and survive as a standalone airline. But the relief did not last. Just months later, Spirit filed for bankruptcy again in August 2025, its second bankruptcy in less than 1 year. At that point, the story had changed completely. Spirit was no longer trying to grow. It was no longer trying to disrupt. It was simply trying to stay alive. The airline cut routes, reduced capacity, furloughed workers, scaled back operations across the country. And by 2026, the situation had become desperate. Then came Spirit's final blow. A surge in jet fuel prices, driven in part by geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, sent operating costs sharply higher at the worst possible time. For a company already on the brink, it was devastating. Spirit's low-cost model left little room to absorb another major expense shock. In a last-ditch effort to save the airline, the Trump administration reportedly explored a $500 million federal rescue package, including financing in exchange for a government stake in the company. But creditors resisted the terms, negotiations stalled, and the deal collapsed. And then, Spirit simply gave up. In the early hours of May 2, 2026, after rescue talks failed and no viable path forward remained, Spirit Airlines announced it was ceasing operations immediately. No gradual wind-down, no months-long sunset period, no farewell tour. Flights were cancelled, planes were grounded, customer service shut down. And just like that, Spirit Airlines was gone. After 34 years in business, the airline that once disrupted an entire industry disappeared almost overnight. Spirit Airlines changed the airline business forever. It normalized ultra-low fares. It helped popularize ancillary fees. It pushed competitors to rethink pricing, and it forced the entire industry to adapt. But in the end, Spirit may have been destroyed by the very world it helped create. Because once every airline learned how to charge for bags, once every airline introduced basic economy, once every airline found ways to compete on price, Spirit was no longer unique. It was simply the most disliked version of a model everyone else had copied. And that is the tragedy of Spirit Airlines. It disrupted an industry, only to be swallowed by the industry it changed. Thank you for watching the Money Archives. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more stories on the rise, fall, and hidden economics behind the world's biggest companies. And let me know in the comments, what company should we uncover next? Until next time, every fortune tells a story.